Hey there, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of The Deliberate Zoomer, hosted by myself, Silas Maynor, and my good friend, Michael Simonton. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Who?
And we are live. So welcome back to another episode of The Deliberate Zoomer, where Silas Maynor and myself, Michael Simonton, will sit down. And currently we are working through Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. So the last episode, we briefly gave an intro to Jordan Peterson, the book, what we're hoping to do with it. And in this episode, we're going to dive into chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 in his rules, 12 Rules for Life, is to the exact title, is to treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. And I mean, it's very simple and upfront, but before we dive, it makes sense up front too. But before we dive into it, I want to pass it off to you, Silas, give you, the opportunity, some initial thoughts. What's your headspace at for this episode?
Yeah, I think that just kind of again, on the surface level, it's a quite straightforward rule. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And if you think about this, you can probably recall, everybody who's listening, times when you were responsible for helping somebody, whether it was a sibling or a parent that was in need, or maybe it was just a friend who's going through a really tough time where you're taking care of them. You have this different level of depth to, and I guess you could say, thoroughness to what you're doing, right? You're very intentional and you put in all your effort because it's somebody that you care about and it's not yourself, right? We have this tendency to somewhat neglect ourselves. I think that in the book, in this title, he ends up talking about kind of how the percentage of people who don't actually fulfill their own prescriptions and how they'll treat their animals better than themselves. But the point is, it makes me think of this line from, I forget the name of the movie, but it was about lifeguards. You have to save yourself first. You can't, if you're about to get drowned, you need to save yourself, because if you cannot if you cannot be alive, you cannot save the drowning person. So I think that that's kind of like the whole idea, is just taking care of yourself the way you take care of other people.
Exactly. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, in a nutshell, on top of that, like you mentioned, think about someone else you're taking care of, or just think about yourself. How many, myself, Silas, how many of us have given friends, family, acquaintances, like solid advice, like just life-changing stuff that if they were to implement, they would be completely different persons. They'd help themselves out so much. How many of us have had that conversation and then we walk away and we don't do any of those things? And that's exactly what he's saying and getting to and driving to with this chapter, is that you need, do as that old montage, do as I say, not as I do. No, it's the opposite. And you do as you say. Your word as a human being should be your bond. As a man, as a woman, as an individual, your word should be your bond. And so, treat yourself like you're responsible as if you're responsible for someone you're helping. If you have a medication that you're supposed to be taking, you force your dog to take that medication if it was sick. You do it every day. You wouldn't care if the dog was unhappy or sad or whatever it was. You're like, no, this medication, my dog needs this to treat his heartworms, for instance. It doesn't matter how it reacts. That's what needs to be done. But when it comes to yourselves and it comes to ourselves, we cut ourselves so much slack. And we're like, I don't really feel like doing it today, even though I know I should. Or, you know what? That person's really probably not the best person to be around, but he's kind of fun. But then you sit down with your friend and you tell them the exact opposite. You're like, yeah, okay, that person's, I know they're fun, but they're a horrible influence. Don't hang out with them. So do that for yourself. And the best way I think you can do this is to, sounds harsh. I think we talked about this a little bit in the previous series, but you got to detach. You got to take a step back and evaluate, and then think logically and have the discipline to follow through on the path that you set out for yourself. So whatever that may be, whatever the situation is, and to treat yourself as if you were someone else. And I do this with myself all the time. Sometimes if I'm having a hard time saying something to someone, or like if I sit down to reply to an email and I'm just blank, I'll be like, okay, wait, if my buddy was over here writing this email up, what would I tell him? And then that's just what I write. And 9 out of 10 times, it's probably way better than something I would have come up with without taking that moment to detach and to think through it logically. I'm currently doing this thing called 75 hard. And part of it is 2 workouts every single day, 45-minute workouts. One has to be outside. The other one can be inside or outside. And the whole point is it's a mental toughness program. It's a pain in the ass, but the whole point is you have to be committed to it. And so like, yeah, most days I'm like, don't want to do that second workout. But I know that I have to, because I've made that commitment to it. But also I know that if it was someone else going through the same thing that I was doing, I would be on them to be like, no, I don't care if it doesn't matter if you don't feel like doing it. You need to do this because it's what you agreed upon. It's what's best for you. And so, take that level of responsibility, of ownership with yourself.
And I think one thing that I'm recalling from the chapter as we're chatting here is that I believe it was this chapter he discussed the idea of having a foundation, right? And when there's chaos, when you're constantly trying to fix issues, like if you have constant if you're constantly managing crises, like you're never going to get to a point where you feel stable that you can have growth. So I think that being able to learn how to, obviously it's like the situation, like if you were out in a survival situation, you need to get food to survive now, but you also need to work to get it so it's more sustainable, that you can build a trap or whatever to catch a rabbit so that you can survive more sustainably in the future, right? So there's that bit of fixing what you have now, but also knowing what, like, I think that's really good what you said, is talking to what would you tell your buddy who is doing this, right? So being a little bit crazy and talking to yourself. I think we all do it. But just giving yourself that advice and then following it, because we generally are able to look at any situation objectively and know a decent path out of it, a decent path out of the chaos. So do that with yourself, not just your friends. And if you're really having a struggle, ask your friend. Like if you really can't figure out which way's up, ask your friends. We all have some kinds of friends. And again, the thing is, because of the relationship that we have with not being in our own self, our friends will likely have good advice, even if they're pretty crappy people. So I think that's important too, is to try to focus on this in order to get your life at a stable ground so that from there you can continue to grow.
Exactly. And, and one of the things that he mentions also in the book is he says, you have to think that it's like, what might my life look like if I were caring for myself properly? So yeah, we're talking about just, taking care of ourselves, but also to bring in also that factor from the book is like, what would your life look like from then? And this also can tie in with like, maybe you're a 5-year planner. But what would your life look like? It allows you to, by taking this mentality to life, by, using it, you're able to really set yourself up for success, because you're thinking about what you look like and like, how would I get there? So for instance, if I want to live, a happy, healthy, whatever, all these things, and I want this sort of life in the future, how do I get there? How am I caring for myself properly today to get to help me, achieve those goals? And so that also ties into here. And probably, if many of you, I probably would, you struggle with that, where you're, some days you don't feel like doing it, whatever it may be, but having that motivating factor of realizing, that goal you're building towards, that can also be beneficial to help you stay consistent and to really take care of yourself like you were someone else.
Yeah. And one thing to consider is that, I mean, we've talked about this essentially in our previous shows, is because we have consciousness, we can set out and we can objectively look at what we've done in the past and then realize the issues, but it comes from that reflection, right? This is something I just did for the new year. My boss had me do, was to go through the data from my last year, from my performance at work, and see, okay, what do I have? And then just looking at that, what should I do differently for this first 6 months of this year? And it was like, it's so self-explanatory. Nobody ever told me how to do this, but you just look through the data and it's so easy to draw the conclusions as to how you should act differently in the future. So in the same way with our daily lives, we can look back and think, okay, what are the struggles I've been dealing with? What are the things I want to fix? And then from there, you can make a nice plan of, okay, I'm going to do these things, right? And I think at some point in the book, he discusses calendars and creating something and sticking to it because we know it, or maybe that's just from one of his lectures. But point is, you can look at what you need to do. You can create a calendar saying, okay, if I'm going to improve this certain aspect of my life, let's say I want to get in better shape, right? So I'm going to get up at this time, right? I'm going to go to bed at this time. And then you set those as targets, because even though you're not going to be 100% consistent, you're going to have a much higher chance of accomplishing those targets. So going through, assessing what you've done, what your issues are, and then what is the solution, and then putting it on the calendar, because we can plan ahead. When we're in the moment, when you're working and things are going wrong at work, you're going to be constantly trying to fix, all these issues. But if you have it on your calendar that, hey, at 12 o'clock every day, I'm going to go for a 5-minute walk and I'm going to take 5 deep breaths and then I'm going to eat a healthy lunch and go back to work, then you're going to stick to it. At least you have a higher probability that you're going to stick to it.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very excellent point. Yeah, no, and as the rule goes, like you said in the very beginning, it is pretty self-explanatory. But that doesn't mean it's easy by any means. And you mentioned, we kind of touched on some of these things, but that's kind of the point here. It's called, we are the deliberate Zoomer, and it's called that. We're helping individuals, live their 20s deliberately, helping Zoomers, live their lives deliberately and set themselves up for success. But the fact of the matter is, so many of these principles are timeless, and they've been, told in so many different ways. So a lot of what you have heard or will continue to hear, a lot of these things interlocked. And I think this is just one of those ones that hasn't really, part of it hasn't been this explicit before. But it's definitely I'd say one of the harder steps to accomplish, and something that will take a lot of hard work and dedication, but the payoff will be astronomical.
Yeah. And I think maybe just to wrap it up, essentially, like if you're struggling with it, try to see yourself, maybe do a life coach session with yourself. If you don't have a real life coach, just objectively look at it and say, like, if I were advising myself on how to live my life healthier, what would I do? Like, what would I tell myself? And this can go all the way back to our episode talking about what's important to you, like writing down what is important to you. Is it health? Is it success in your career? Whatever it is, what would you tell yourself to accomplish those things? So just have that little bit of a strategy session, as my boss would call it, and then set out some plans from there, because something is better than nothing. And the whole, again, as you mentioned, the whole point of this being deliberate is that we have consciousness. We can choose what we do. We choose every day. We make so many decisions and do the things that really are going to help you get towards your goal. And if you don't know what your goal is, do the things that interest you so you can help find your goal out. So I think that's a pretty good note to close it on. Was there anything else you wanted to mention briefly?
Oh, no, I was just briefly, thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate you hit that like, subscribe, comment, share, do all the things. Obviously, we're nowhere near big enough to ads. But regardless, we would want to. So, if you're listening to it, if you found it valuable, if it brought some insights, and someone who could use a message like this, please share it with them. The whole goal is to help people, to empower them to live their lives deliberately. So thanks so much for tuning in, and have a good one.